Hello and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News Channel. Well, we're going to talk about China today. Not really with China and crypto, but why China and the president Xi Jinping, or God Emperor Xi Jinping, because he's president for life basically, might actually be very, very screwed. Now, the thing about Xi Jinping is you need to understand he's actually not a pragmatic leader. Unlike Jiang Zemin and some of his predecessors who made friends with everyone in high positions, Xi Jinping actually got there kind of ruthlessly, and a lot of people really, really hate him. So he can't actually fall from power, because if he gives up power, he's going to die. So he's not going to step down because he understands that point very, very well. Now, we're going to talk about the recent protests with the COVID restrictions and why those are actually important. There was actually a fire that actually killed people because of the recent COVID protests. And people got all mad about that, and there's protests everywhere around China. Now, are those protests going to basically be the downfall of Xi Jinping? By themselves, probably not. And it's because it's not big enough. Now, if there's another accident due to COVID restrictions, that could well spell the end, because then the flames will actually rise and it could become like Tiananmen Square. And they were barely able to contain Tiananmen Square. And I'm not really sure if they could actually suffer another one in these kind of economic conditions. Now, the thing about Tiananmen Square that people don't know is, yes, everyone knows that they sent the army to actually take care of the protesters at Tiananmen Square. What people don't know is that the first brigadier general that they actually wanted to send there actually refused the order because he didn't want to go, quell citizens. And that's problematic for them. The second guy obviously heeded order, so they got rid of the first guy and they sent another guy there. But if there's a succession of generals that say no, we're not going to do this, we're not going to go quell ordinary citizens, then the government kind of collapses because you lose the military lead. And I think if there's a bunch of COVID protests and they have to continue to quell citizens, there will be dissension in the military. And if your military leaders dissent, then basically you are dead, because essentially then your whole regime falls apart. And like I said, if Xi Jinping loses power or steps down, it's kind of like Vladimir Putin. I think they know they can't actually step down after failure because they're both going to get killed if they do. So that's kind of one of the reasons why Putin isn't going to ever gracefully back out of Ukraine, because he can't. Same thing with Xi Jinping. He can't gracefully step down. He has too many enemies within China. So if he tries to gracefully step down, someone is going to gracefully put a bullet through his head. Not so gracefully, I guess. So Xi is very, very concerned about holding on to his own power and his own life, obviously. And that's why he's so afraid of these protests, because they're not only a challenge onto his power, they do threaten his life from other people that don't really like him. And there's a lot of people that don't really like him. The thing is, a lot of you think the Chinese Communist Party is one continuous homogenous body. It's not. There's very different factions in the party. And I know for a fact from little birds that have told me that basically there is a growing group of dissent within the Communist Party against Xi Jinping, even among the communist leadership. But they dare not voice their opposition to Xi Jinping because they're afraid of Xi Jinping, because he controls the military and the leadership, which is why it's so important that he keeps control of the military and the secret police, because he knows that there's a party that dissents in the high leadership of the Communist Party from him, but they go along with what he says because they don't really have the power to stop him. If there's enough dissent building up, then he's in real trouble, and he will fall like any other authoritarian leaders fall. Remember, despite what you may think if you think that whether you think the election's rigged or not, that's really your choice. We actually have an election every 4 years, and you can actually replace the leaders. Now, a lot of you argue that it doesn't really matter who you vote for. And I don't agree with you on that, but you can actually go vote. And yes, the representatives and senators do get replaced every single election cycle. And sometimes the president gets replaced every 4 years. See, in China, you don't really have that option. See, the leader, the president or the premier or whatever, basically is picked by the party itself, and Xi Jinping's made himself basically president for life. So the only way to get rid of him, if the people get fed up, is for revolts. It's like the old Chinese emperors. You don't like the emperor? Well, the only way to get rid of them is to put that an imperial yellow coat around your own shoulders and declare yourself the emperor and start a revolt. That's essentially the only way. That actually hasn't changed for 3,000 years in China. It's still kind of the same way. The party more or less just acts like an emperor, just on kind of like an extended scale, especially now with internet monitoring and such. So the authoritarian regime is just basically switched from like absolute monarchy to like absolute dictatorship. It hasn't really gotten any better. But if people get fed up enough, especially if the military gets fed up enough, then they can actually be overthrown. And even in the leadership, there is a lot of dissent. It's just not enough to overthrow Xi because he actually controls the army. And that's another important point I want to mention, the army itself. See, here in the United States is the U.S. Army. Yes, the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army, but the army honestly belongs to the people and is supposed to protect the Constitution and the rights of its citizens. That's not true with the Chinese army. The Chinese army, if you actually read in the bylaws, it actually belongs directly to the Communist Party. So technically, the Communist Party is who the army fights for, and they made sure of that because they don't want the army getting wrong ideas that they're actually representing the people. Yeah, it's called the People's Liberation Party, but it's actually the Communist Party's own private army. But that doesn't mean people are complete robots. They can actually dissent if things get too bad. Now, like I said, I don't think the current protests are bad enough. But if the Communist Party has a few more accidents, I guess, with the COVID restrictions, I do think it'll get really bad. And that's when his seat is really going to be up for grabs. Now, the other thing is Joe Biden just kind of like pwned Xi Jinping recently with the announcement that America is actually going to stop all chip shipments to China. And it's not only the American-made chips. It's basically like any process that has anything to do in America. So like Taiwan's TSMC is not going to ship China its chips anymore. China essentially has to make most of its own chips. And they're not going to be able to get the best generation chips. Now, the thing about China is they're great at copying other people's technology. They're not that great at making their own technology. And that's been the case for a couple of decades now. Anyone in the know, if you held them to tell you the truth, they will actually tell you that they're not that great at coming up with innovations and their own technology. And you're saying, yeah, but they invented paper and gunpowder and the compass. Yeah, they did. I mean, I'm well aware of Chinese history. It's my own history. They have invented a lot of things hundreds or thousands of years in the past. They haven't really been so hot lately in inventing things, and it's partly because of political structure and like, you know, their thought processes are pretty closed, and they don't really have like too many Nobel laureates coming out of China these days. So them actually have to manufacturing their own chips actually will really, really hurt their exports. And just like America is trying to bring chip manufacturing onto its own ground with like plants in Arizona coming up. It's going to take several years. In China, it's going to take even more years. Now, some pundits in China say that's good because it'll force China to actually make its own technology and it'll be beneficial for China in the future. That might be true in like 10, 20 years. But the thing is, the Xi Jinping regime may not actually be able to last that long. If China's exports go down like that so drastically because of the chip ban, and China's revenue and GDP start going downward, like Xi is actually going to lose a lot of his authority and his credibility. The only thing that keeps his party credible and his regime going is the great economy and how great the economy's been doing over the last 10 years or so. However, if the economy stops being so great, then he loses a lot of legitimacy in the people's eyes. Losing legitimacy plus drastic and disastrous COVID shutdowns could actually push him out of power. So I actually see Biden basically with his proclamation of banning American chips from China as just as dangerous as these protests, but it's going to play out for a much longer time because it directly affects China's economy. Like, I don't think most people realize how devastating Biden's like chip ban is for Xi Jinping in China. It can, accompanied with other things going wrong in China, push Xi out of power. And like the Chinese government and the communists and the communist government, they've actually seen that they can't just go on with the COVID protests anymore because they see that it's going to really rock their power. And that's why they're pulling back on the COVID restrictions because they know they can't suppress the populace. Now, some of you are saying like, within China, why can't they just block the internet and not let people know that other people are unhappy about the protests? And why can't they stop it from spreading? It's because they can't block off the entire internet. Like people will find ways if it gets spread wide enough. And there's like secret codes that like Chinese people use to spread the news around. And the dissent is actually growing. So if you combine that with the downfall in the economy that China might actually be facing because of the Biden chip ban, that could possibly take down the regime if the regime screws up a couple more times, which could definitely happen at any time. So that's why Xi Jinping in China is very, very much in trouble, and at least Xi's regime is in trouble. China can survive without the Communist Party. China was there before the Communist Party, and China will be there long after the Communist Party. I'm not really worried about my home country. They'll be fine. There'll be some revolutions, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to suffer, which I hate. But sometimes when you have a dictatorial regime, that just tends to happen whenever you change governments. Now, I don't have hugely high hopes that it's going to become a democracy afterwards, because generally, in China, they still have the mindset of kind of like imperial rule. They've had the last, I would guess, several thousand years, and it's really hard to change people's mindset on that. And if you ask a lot of people in China, they're like, they really just don't understand how American democracy works. They're like, how is it stable if you change power of people every 4 years and the administration changes every 4 years? Isn't there some internal strife? How does this peaceful transfer of power work? They actually expect something like January 6th on a much larger scale every single time power transfer. They in their mind, they just don't understand how peaceful transfer of power works because it's never really happened in China before. Because in China, a transfer of power is always accompanied by a bloody coup and a large war. They don't understand how this voting thing actually works. There's a joke about, people in Taiwan say, we're very advanced. We can get our voting results the same night of the election. And Chinese people are like, we're even more advanced than you. We know the election results even before we go vote. Now, obviously, that's just a joke because obviously who wins is actually determined beforehand, obviously in China. But, that's just kind of how the Chinese thinking actually works. It's very hard for them to grasp the concept of American democracy and how it can actually work. So the thing is, if there's a bloody coup right now, the administration that replaces this one could actually be worse or just as bad. So I don't have too high of hopes that it's going to convert instantly into a democracy, but at least there's a chance for change if that actually happens. And I'm sure America's going to get involved with their CIA, and it's not going to turn out well for America. I can almost guarantee you that. When America really gets deep into another country's foreign affairs, it pretty much never turns out well for America. I think we all know that, right? But they're going to try. But that's my thing about why China and Xi Jinping could definitely be in trouble and why they're so afraid of the protests. Xi is he's really battling for his life, and he knows there's dissent in the communist government already. And the thing is, any little thing can actually set it off now. And Xi is really, really worried about the chip ban that Joe Biden just placed on China, because that can really, really, really make him lose legitimacy, because that will impact the economy in a huge, massive way. They basically shut down half of China's manufacturing just by that this ban. And China's basically just hoping that the U.S. will reverse course sometime. This also might make them think about attacking Taiwan more, because they need those chip manufacturing plants in Taiwan as well. So that's the last thing I have to say. I think Taiwan needs to strengthen up its defenses. America needs to recommit to defending Taiwan and maybe send a few more forces there, because this chip ban that America has placed on China is actually going to really make them think about attacking Taiwan, because they really, really need those microchips for their economy and everything else. So that's the news for today. Let me know what you think. Like and subscribe. Hit that bell notifications button, and I will see you guys later.